A very fascinating thing I run into shockingly frequently is strange claims about how specific jobs work that sometimes never was true, but a lot of the time were true at one point. Often a long time ago though. I want to go over a handful of these kinds of myths, about one per job, but not all jobs, ranging from the completely absurd to just weird misunderstandings. And if you know of some strange common misunderstanding you keep seeing everywhere, do be sure to share it in the comments. Now, let's get myth busting. Number 1. Make sure you space out your holy casts to get maximum stun value. Now, holy has an odd delay between finishing the cast and the damage, and so the stun, landing. And due to the way diminishing returns work, you should expect 4 seconds, 2 seconds, and 1 second worth of stun combined. However, a common suggestion is to deliberately space out your holy casts to make sure your next stun lands once the previous one has fully finished, to make sure to not lose any value. The thing is, simply casting holy repeatedly happens to, somehow, naturally line up such that the stuns don't seem to eat off each other. Sometimes you may lose a single second of stun, leading to a combined 6 seconds, approximately, but other times it is also possible, somehow, to get 8 seconds of stun by somehow getting 4 seconds, 2 seconds, and 2 seconds. The important part is that by simply spamming holy, you should expect to get the correct amount of stuns, so there is no need to try and get smart with it. But there is actually more to it than that. While an enemy is stunned, their auto-attack timer and other cooldowns hypothetically are still counting. This means that, in a way, a combined 6-second stun is far superior to a 4-second stun, 2-second stun, and 1-second stun separately. But why would that be? Well, let's say an enemy has a swing timer of 3 seconds. You stun them right after their first swing, so they're stunned for 4 seconds. 3 seconds of that they spent waiting for their auto-attack anyway. Then 1 more second passes and the stun ends, and they swing. Let's say you then stun them 1 second later, so they're stunned for 2 seconds, but there's only 2 seconds left on their swing timer, so they swing again the instant they're no longer stunned, meaning the stun effectively did nothing. The same is likely to happen with a 1-second stun. On the other hand, if you just spam holy to chain stun the enemy, even if you were unlucky and only got 6 seconds of stun, the exact same scenario would lead to the mob waiting 3 seconds for their auto-attack and then be stunned, actually, for 3 seconds while having nothing to do. Of course, if you need to cast something else than holy, that's a whole different story. And given the previous example, you could of course get even more sweaty with optimizing the stuns. There isn't any reason to, but you could, by timing your stuns just a moment before the mob would be ready to swing again. But the important thing is that intentionally spreading out the stuns is kinda like shooting yourself in the foot. You're not gaining any more value and you're just losing damage. Number 2. Now that Black Mage's spells have shorter cast times than the GZD and no timer to worry about, spell speed sucks. This one is obviously very new and quite peculiar. Now, the thing is, whether spell speed is good or not is a rather number-crunchy question, and simulations suggest that spell speed builds have either more potential than crit builds, or at least just as much, for Black Mage. However, the reasoning for the claim suggests a whole different misunderstanding. A surprising amount of players believe that spell speed reduces cast times, but not the GZD. Or alternatively, think that the GZD reduction part is irrelevant. If that were the case, then obviously Black Mage would hate spell speed now that all of their relevant spells have shorter cast times than the GZD. However, that is not quite how that works. Spell speed reduces both the cast times and the GZD, and also increases the damage of spell-based dots like Thunder, although that part is a minor detail. This means the more spell speed you have, the more flare stars you get. The more spell speed you have, the more spells you may be able to sneak inside raid buffs or gem drafts. Notably, ley lines reducing your GCD and cast times further also means that this can compound on itself a bit, that the more speed you have, the more spells you can fit inside ley lines, thereby giving you even more spells. Naturally, a crit-centric build instead focuses on making the most of each Flare Star and Xenoglossy, and gains value in its own way. But spell speed is actually very good right now. There's also one more reason why these changes have made speed better rather than worse. This is due to the effect we commonly call caster tax. Whenever you cast anything with a cast time, it takes about 0.1 second longer than it says to actually resolve it. And this means, for instance, that Fire 4 baseline takes 2.1 seconds to cast rather than 2.0. Or Fire 2 takes 3.1 seconds instead of 3.0. You can see this reflected in the way that each cast, there is, somehow, enough time for the cast bar to disappear and reappear, despite Fire 2's cast time suggesting you could perfectly chain them. Obviously, for spells with cast times lower than the GCD, we don't really care most of the time, but if the cast time is longer than the GCD or equal to the GCD, the caster tax is technically added on top. This is also why if you weave something after one of those 2-second cast times, it takes a combined 2.7 seconds before your next spell, instead of about 2.6, ignoring latency, as the caster tax delays the weave by 0.1 second longer too. Why this impacts spell speed's value so much is that, for example, old Fire 4's cast time was 2.8 seconds, which meant that it would take 2.8 seconds reduced by spell speed and then plus 0.1 seconds. Like, imagine if spell speed outright stated that it only affected about 96% of the cast and the last 4% was just locked in and fixed, for whatever reason. That is effectively what it did, so the cast time reduction removing this factor of course made spell speed better, just in a performance sense rather than in a convenience sense. Arguably, the old advantages of crit versus speed are still there. Slower builds get quote-unquote more mobility out of their instants, slower builds have an easier time doing tight transpose spamming tricks, faster builds run through their rotation faster and so can reach their natural instant casts more frequently, and especially now are more likely to be able to simply fit their casts in between necessary movements. But the important part is that spell speed is great for Black Mage. Number 3. Death's design is a dot. I know, some people say this just to be funny. They definitely also recognize that no, it increases damage taken, but prefer to call it a dot as it is faster and shorter to say. The same happened with Viper's Noxious Gnash when it existed, and in fact has led to some players that didn't get to experience it, thinking Viper actually had a dot, spreading misinformation. Now, there is actually a good reason why the distinction between this debuff increases the damage you do to the enemy and this just does damage over time matters, and why it can be problematic to refer to both as dots, regardless of how you think. You wouldn't call a damage buff on yourself a dot after all, would you? Now, the reason that this matters is related to dot snapshotting specifically. A debuff like Death's Design essentially improves all damage you do, obviously, which means it isn't the end of the world if it ends while you're using your worst attacks. It sucks, but it isn't nearly as bad as if it runs out during your best attacks. On the other hand, a real dot is effectively a regular attack with an artificial cooldown for each individual enemy. Again, obviously. Now, the key distinction is that due to the existence of dot snapshotting, if Death's Design was in fact a dot, optimizing Reaper would involve applying it at the start of a burst window and then making sure it is fully maxed out at the end of the burst, and then avoiding reapplying it until it essentially fully runs out to make sure the whole dot gets the value. You can see how this plays out for Bard, as they apply their dots in their opener and then use Iron Jaws to reapply them just as buffs are about to run out, to get maximum damage dots for 45 seconds or so. In other words, the reason why the distinction between a dot and a debuff that increases damage taken matters is because the way you would need to play around it is drastically different. Number 4. Don't you dare give Dark Knight's barriers, it'll prevent their TBN from breaking properly. Oh yeah, and also, much more rarely, TBN doesn't benefit from personal mitigation. So, the second one of these, well, the way to test it is to be hit by a tank buster with TBN active, see how much damage it does, preferably it does more damage than the barrier's size, then get hit by the same tank buster, but with mitigation like Rampart or Shattered Vigil. Generally, this kind of myth comes about from players that never bother to even test a thing before they start claiming it. For the first statement though, there is no need to worry about this barrier priority problem, as barriers have a priority list in what barrier is spent first, and this list is not first come first serve, which might have caused problems for Dark Knight if it were. It appears to be dictated by a combination of logical reasoning and max duration of barriers. Case in point, TBN appears to break first before most barriers in the game, as its duration is a measly 7 seconds. A particular barrier that is known to have a higher priority than TBN is Reaper's Arcane Crest, which makes sense since it only has a duration of 5 seconds. Arguably, the Reaper would probably also prefer that their own barrier that they put on themselves has higher priority than the one provided by some other player, given the effects when they pop. Another example of barriers that are in a priority based on logical reasoning are the Scholar and Sage barriers when they crit. Scholar's Adloquium applies an extra barrier when it crits, called Catalyze. This barrier takes priority over the regular Galvanize. This makes sense, as Scholars might appreciate protecting Galvanize to use deployment tactics. In fact, in most situations, they wouldn't particularly care about whether Galvanize breaks at all, aside from, getting value out of the barrier they paid for. On the other hand, a Sage's Eucration Diagnosis also applies an extra shield called Differential Diagnosis when it crits. However, in this case, Eucration Diagnosis breaks first, which makes sense, as Sage has nothing they can use the shield for, and it breaking provides them an Adder Sting, so opposite to Scholar, a Sage would much prefer the regular shield breaks first, any day. The fact the game has logical priorities like this should tell you that TBN should be in no danger of not breaking, aside from the enemy simply lacking the damage to break it in the first place. Finally, number 5. Warriors hate direct hit, never use it. This one, unlike the other 4, is something that used to be true. The origin of the statement is Stormblood, with the release of Inner Release's effect of guaranteeing direct hits. At the time, and until things changed, Warriors actually garnered more value from simply having Determination instead. Even a single increment of direct hit was generally considered less valuable than Determination, due to how the Determination would increase the damage of the guaranteed direct hits, which would be more impactful than any potential random direct hits outside of burst situations. However, early on in Endwalker, the way guaranteed critical hits and direct hits interact with buffs and stats was changed. Guaranteed critical hits convert any critical hit chance from buffs into additional crit damage. Crit chance from stats does not get applied, as the stat already grants crit damage by default. Guaranteed direct hits convert any direct hit chance from buffs into additional direct hit damage. Additionally, and this applies only to direct hits, not crits as mentioned, the direct hit stats also increase the direct hit damage of guaranteed direct hits. This means that an effect like Inner Release simply turns any direct hit you may have into more damage, making direct hit actually good for warriors and no longer necessary to avoid. An additional oddity with this specific feature is that this applies even to actions that don't actually mention it. Pixelmancer's Hammer Stamp combo does not mention this property, but demonstrates the exact same behavior of benefiting from critical hit rate boosting buffs and both direct hit, the stat, and buffs increasing it. Which is to say, we can assume, unless proven otherwise for specific examples, that anything that is a guaranteed critical hit or direct hit will have these properties. Do you know of some odd myths, misconceptions, or misunderstandings you've bumped into surprisingly frequently, or perhaps just something you'd love to have tested? Do be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in the days where warriors hated direct hit, there was a surprisingly common preference to have just one direct hit materia, which would give about 1% direct hit chance, because having the chance seemed reasonable and worthwhile. If you were really lucky, it could end up being beneficial after all, right? However, it turned out that investing those same points into determination was effective enough that the determination was considered better than the average result from that direct hit chance, leading to warriors being advised to avoid this odd trick.